Just get the recording going here. All right. So last week we talked about we introduced the Crusades, and we talked about the First Crusade, or the beginning of it. And we split the First Crusade into two crusades: the Peasants' Crusade, which was a populist, almost millenarian, end of times motivated group of people, with the Prince's Crusade, which was a group led by competent military leadership made up of the nobility of Europe, people who had been warring ever since they were young. And we followed them through both sets. We followed them through to Constantinople, to the Peasants' Crusade, to defeat almost immediately on the other side of the Bosporus, and the Prince's Crusade, to victory after victory that they just barely eked out, but nonetheless they eked them out. And we ended up at Antioch, where they sieged Antioch and they took the city, and just as they took the city and were about to attack the citadel, they have another Muslim relief army coming up to relieve the city. And the Crusaders, despite being in a bad position, they sally forth, they defeat the relief army, which causes the citadel of Antioch to surrender. And so here we are now in Antioch in early 1099, and things are still not going well for the Crusaders. Now, in terms of military situation, their military situation has certainly improved. But what has not improved is the food situation. This is in terms of food, what's happened is the armies have stripped the land of all there is. They've basically stripped the city of its reserves, and the armies that have been attacking them, part of what their strategy is to strip the land themselves. So you have two armies stripping the land, one for their own survival and one to destroy the army they're fighting. And you have a city which has held out, and so its reserves are quite low. And so they're dealing with a lot of starvation and a lot of disease, including the plague, the greatest pandemic in history. And they fought amongst themselves about what to do with Antioch. Remember, they had taken an oath to the Byzantine Emperor Alexius, and they had promised that they would return any territory that they captured back to the Byzantines. And that was the whole point of the First Crusade, was to to reclaim for the Byzantine Empire lands that they had lost to Muslim invaders. Now, there's some debate amongst the Crusaders about how to do that. So basically, some Crusaders say, we should give back this city to the Byzantines. We promised to do that. We swore an oath to do this. That is our job. We need to do this. And there are other Crusaders who say, no, Alexius turned back. Remember, when Stephen of Blois went and as he deserted the army, he met Alexius, who was on his way to help the Crusaders at Antioch. And Stephen tells him, they're all going to die. This is a hopeless situation. Don't even bother. Go back home. And so Alexius does. Probably the worst decision he ever made. But nonetheless, the Crusaders feel abandoned by the Byzantines. And so they're debating now in early 1099 what they're going to do with Antioch. And so just to give an idea of how desperate the situation is, there are accounts that the Crusaders resorted to cannibalism at this time. Now, it's a little bit iffy. The accounts are a little bit iffy, but there was probably some cannibalism going on, because we not only see this from Muslim chroniclers of the time, we also see this from Christian chroniclers who were with the Crusaders. They both report cannibalism of some sort. Some of it is highly sensationalized, but nonetheless, it does happen. So we have accounts of, the Crusaders allegedly roasting Muslims for food, eating children, that sort of thing. Now that's kind of sensationalized, but nonetheless, when you're in a cannibalistic situation, or if you've ever looked at times in human history where cannibalism has been the primary way of surviving, like the Donner Party, for example, it's believable. Now, there are some chroniclers in the Christian camp who are going to be writing this in a sensationalistic way, because they're looking to sidetrack their master's rivals. So they work for noblemen, and they're trying to do is say, well, that guy's troops, they were cannibals. And so they're trying to kind of jockey for positions to who is the more righteous. So that's where the that's where the sensationalizations from the Christian side would come in. The sensationalizations from the Muslim side, they come in because it's the opposing army, and so naturally it's good propaganda to hype up any of that. But nonetheless, it probably happened in some form or another. So in early 1099, they're squabbling about Antioch. The leaders are trying to decide what to do, and it gets so bad, and the squabbling continues among the noblemen, and eventually all these knights who are following them say, look, you guys can sit here and you can squabble all you want, but we're going to go on to Jerusalem unless you guys come to some sort of settlement here. And so they do. They come to a settlement where Bohemond of Taranto stays in Antioch and becomes the first prince of Antioch, which makes it the second Crusader state. At this time, as the Crusaders move on to Jerusalem, they're not met by a lot of resistance. Remember, they've defeated several large, well-equipped armies. The appetite for the local Muslim nobility to attack and to defend or try and defend against the Crusaders is kind of at a low ebb. And what we see also is that the Muslim world is not a united front here. There is not a single leadership. There's not a single unitary government structure. There's squabbles between local lords and bigger lords. And so these little local lords who are on the road to Jerusalem say, you know what, instead of wasting our resources attacking these guys who appear to be on what amounts to an armed pilgrimage, let's just let them go through. Because if we let them go through, they'll get to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is Fatimid territory. It's Egyptian territory. It's not our territory. What do we care about defending that? So they let them go through. And they even supply them in some cases. So right away the Crusaders are kind of gaining local allies a little bit by playing into local politics. The Crusaders attempted to. This is kind of a side note, but they attempted a failed siege of Arca, which is a city along the way. And basically, what happened was they had the Holy Lance. If you remember the Holy Lance, they found this thing in the cathedral, this spear. This was the lance that had pierced Christ's side, and so they decided that. They were following this thing. This was their relic, and so they were besieging the city of Arca, and it wasn't going very well. And so they decided, well, there must be a problem with this lance. Maybe God is angry at us for some reason. And so what they do is they put it through trial by ordeal. So the supporters of the lance decide that they will do trial by fire, and this is where they have two fires going on either side, and they get them really hot on either side, and then there's a lane down the middle. And so the guy will walk through this lane, and if he comes out the other side perfectly fine, the lance is real. God has vindicated him. But if he doesn't, he's a liar, and the lance is fake. And he walks through, and he gets burned horribly, and he dies, and the lance is proved to be a fake. But nonetheless, it still had its proponents, as many relics do, but nonetheless, that was kind of what happened at Arca. But in any case, on June 7th, the Crusaders get to Jerusalem. Now, the Fatimid governor of Jerusalem, he decides that he is going to attempt to burden the Christian army by sending Christians in the city out into the army. He's going to kick them out of the city and say, you guys, you're responsible for feeding these people. And we all kind of know how this works when we remember the sieges of Jerusalem in the past by the Romans. Invading armies typically do not take on the challenge of feeding these extra people. They kind of just let them go on their way, or in fact, they might even kill them if they're too burdensome. So it was really quite a bloody situation. And the siege of Jerusalem is really no different. So when the Crusaders get to Jerusalem, they immediately lay siege. Now, the city is quite formidable. It has a wall approximately 4 kilometers long. It's about 10 feet thick and about 50 feet high. So it's quite a formidable fortification. And the Crusaders decide that they're going to split into 2 groups and they're going to siege this thing from both sides. Now, time is of the essence here because the Fatimids in Egypt, the rulers of Egypt, are sending a relief force to Jerusalem to relieve the garrison. And so the Crusaders have to take the city before this army arrives. So the defenders of Jerusalem attempt to delay the Crusader siege by cutting down all the orchards around Jerusalem. If you remember your Bible, Jerusalem is a city of orchards. There's lots of olive trees around the city. Even today, that is the case. Lots of fruit orchards. And so what they try and do is they cut down all these trees to prevent the Christians from being able to build siege engines. And also to afflict them with, again, food shortages. And Jerusalem, being where it is very hot in summer. And this is the height of summer. This is June. And so there are water shortages here, there are food shortages, and there's the debilitating heat of the Palestinian summer. If anybody's been to Israel in summer, you will know about the heat, up to 40 degrees in some cases. So very, very hot. And if you're a knight in armor, this is even worse. You're cooking in your armor. So the Crusaders aren't even able to really engage in the style of warfare that they prefer, because they can't, the knights can't wear their armor. But help comes to them when a fleet of Genoese ships, so ships from Genoa, land at the port of Jaffa, and they bring siege engines. They bring them in kits. This is the kind of the brilliance of medieval warfare. They bring them in kits, you assemble them like IKEA furniture, and away you go. The Crusaders on July 14th, so this is just a little over a month after they arrive, they assault the city, and they gain a foothold on the wall, which basically causes the defense to collapse, because once your enemy is on the wall, it's very difficult to push him off the wall, because he's just going to keep piling in. And so that basically collapses the defense of the city. Now, the Crusaders, being good Christians, massacre almost everybody in the city. This is a very, very bloody week. It's about 40,000 people, Muslim and Christian, are estimated to have been slaughtered in Jerusalem at this time. The Crusaders did not intentionally kill Christians, which the majority would have been Orthodox Christians, but they got mixed up because they look Eastern. They dress kind of like the Muslims do. They just kind of look like them, and so naturally they're going to get caught up in the massacre. So it's a very, very bloody siege, and this siege is seared into the memory of the Islamic religion even to this day. This is one of the points that they use in debate against Christians as to which religion is the true religion: Christianity, which massacred 40,000 innocents, or Islam. This is one of the grievances that is brought up against Christianity, and it's a pretty good grievance. So on July 22nd, the Crusader leaders, they meet in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to decide how Jerusalem was to be governed, and this is going to be critical. Raymond of Toulouse, the Count of Toulouse, was offered the crown, but very piously, he's a very pious man. He is the man who said that we should give Antioch back to the Byzantines because we promised that we would, where the other Crusaders said forget about it. Raymond says, no, I'm not going to accept the crown of Jerusalem because only Christ can be king of Jerusalem. Very pious man. Godfrey of Bouillon was then offered the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre, which he accepted. So in the first year of its reign, it did not have a king. It had kind of a protector who had the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. In August of 1099, Godfrey leads an army against the Fatimid army at Ascalon. I'll put a map up very soon, and you can see where that is. And after they attack Ascalon, most of the Crusaders consider their vows fulfilled, and most of them will pick up stakes and go back to Europe. So Ascalon is important because it's a city on the coast of the Mediterranean behind Jerusalem, allowing access by Muslims to the back door of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It's a weak point. It's the Achilles heel of this kingdom. And so capturing it was important. But they failed. Godfrey failed to capture Ascalon. And what he should have done is press the attack, but he didn't. And so you have now this city, which remains a threat to the kingdom, sitting back there, just waiting to kind of blow up. Now, the Crusaders will, in future years, manage to retake Ascalon, but for a long time, this is going to be a thorn in their side. So Baldwin, the Count of Edessa, if you remember when we talked about him, he's the guy who tricked the king of Edessa into giving him his territory. He is eventually chosen to be the new king after Godfrey dies in 1100. and he becomes King Baldwin I of Jerusalem. And this is what the Crusader states will essentially look like. This is what they will be kind of at their height. In the north, you'll have the county of Edessa, the most remote of the Crusader states. Then underneath is Antioch, with the great city of Antioch, the great fortress of Antioch, which managed to hold out probably the longest. Then you have the county of Tripoli, and then you have the kingdom of Jerusalem in the bottom. Now, generally speaking, all the lords of Antioch, of Tripoli, of Edessa, they all owed fealty to the king of Jerusalem. But in practice, this would be a more difficult thing to accomplish. Ascalon, I don't know if you can see, where's my cursor? Oh, it's not showing up. Ascalon is right over here. And so you can see if that city is held by the Fatimids in Egypt, it's very much an Achilles heel for the kingdom. And it will be a bit of a problem for them. So after the First Crusade, the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Crusader states quickly move into different alliances with each other. And these alliances are often based on political grudges and personal grudges. And these grudges guide foreign policy. It's a good medieval kingdom. There was some talk early on about setting it up as a theocratic state. So a state governed by the church under the authority of the Patriarch of Jerusalem, who was, of course, appointed by the Pope. Now, Godfrey of Bouillon, the guy who took the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre, was thought to have favored this plan, but he died, and so naturally it didn't come to fruition. Baldwin becoming king, and of course, if you can become king, why not? So the Crusaders established a societal and a social or a governmental system very much based on French feudalism. And if you read the literature from the time, you will always see the Crusaders, no matter what their origin, referred to as Franks. They are always referred to by Muslims as Franks, and even referred to by Christians as Franks. It's because of the French-dominated nature of the army and the French nature of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So if you see that if you're reading the literature, it doesn't matter if you were a German Crusader or a French Crusader or an English Crusader, you were all called Franks in the Holy Land. The Crusader nobles took estates, just much like they would have in Europe, and basically a lot of noblemen stayed. Now, why would they stay? Why, if you were a nobleman from Europe, would you stay in the Holy Land? What's holding you there? Well, a lot of these guys, if you remember, Baldwin of Boulogne, who became Baldwin I, only had land in Europe through his wife. His wife was the inheritor of the land of his estates in Europe. It was her land. And when she died, that land passed to another branch of her family. So he had nothing left in Europe. And that's the case with many of these noblemen, except Raymond of Toulouse. I don't understand, because he's the Count of Toulouse. Toulouse is a large, rich county in southern France. So I really don't understand why he stayed. Maybe it was the piety thing. But in any case, it could have been also that as Count of Tripoli, he had more free reign to govern his lands as he saw fit. But in any case, it's an interesting thing. So the question is, why does it succeed? Why does this crusade, which had everything against it, succeed? The Islamic world, basically at this time, is politically divided and uncharacteristically weak militarily. Generally speaking, before this time, the Muslim world is a strong military power. Remember, they had thrown the Byzantines out of North Africa, out of Arabia, out of the Middle East, out of Asia Minor, and kept them to the city of Constantinople and portions of Greece and portions of Italy. But at this time, things had weakened down. There was a split. There were different caliphates. So a caliphate in the Muslim world is a spiritual leader of Islam. So if you're a caliph, you're claiming that you are the successor to the Prophet Muhammad and that you have the authority to lead all of Islam. And every Muslim owes you fealty and obedience. And so in this time, there's two main caliphates going on. There's the caliph in Cairo, so in Egypt, who's called the Fatimid Caliphate. And then there's the caliph in Mosul, who is the Abuid Caliphate. So there's two people claiming that they are the caliph of Islam, which means that now people have to choose sides. So that's part of this whole thing. Then you also have the issue of local Muslim lords being suspicious of each other. They don't trust each other. They think that the bigger lords from Mosul and larger cities are trying to take over their territory, and so they don't want to ally with them because that might bring them under the sphere of influence of another lord. But so they might ally or at least help the Crusaders to help maintain their own independence. The Muslim world's also not ready for the Crusaders. They're not really prepared. When we see that with the Turkish assaults, even though they're large, they're not really well prepared to deal with the Crusaders, and also the Fatimids who governed Egypt, and the Seljuk Turks who reside in Anatolia and Asia Minor, just across from Constantinople. They're weakening as a state organization. They're starting to weaken at this time. The Ottoman Turks will move into Anatolia and Asia Minor in the centuries after this, and they will be the ones who capture Constantinople, not the Seljuk Turks. The Crusade was led by very competent and experienced military leaders. It was initiated during a period of social upheaval in Europe. There were poor harvests, changing climate, etc., that contributed to movements like millenarianism and this idea that people were no longer feeling safe and secure at home, and they wanted to seek something different, something better. There was nothing holding them to the land. If your crops are constantly failing, why are you going to stay here? You may as well go try someplace else. Maybe God will bless you as on the way. The piety is becoming just a more important thing at this time. Pilgrimages, going to see relics, attempting to do good works to claim your place in heaven and to reduce your time in purgatory is increasing. The opportunity to get rich and to claim land in the Holy Land is attractive to many minor knights and nobles because they don't have lots of land. Minor knights don't have any land. In fact, some of them, because they essentially work as mercenaries for wealthier knights. So this is a chance to kind of make your way in the world. And again, the sense of adventure, that's a strong pull. Why do people travel? Why do young people travel? They want that sense of adventure to kind of get out of the place that they're stuck in. Not that you wouldn't want to be stuck in Grunthal. It's such a wonderful place. So the Kingdom of Jerusalem expanded. It managed to expand during the period after the First Crusade. And despite being small, and despite being weakened from the fact that most of the Crusaders up stakes and moved back to Europe, it managed to grow. And it did this by cultivating relationships in Europe, in particular the Italian city-states, the King of Norway, interestingly enough. But there would be as time goes on, Europeans will continue to come to the Holy Land. So there will always be a trickle of knights or soldiers or people, small contingents sent by kings, large armies sent for a short time by certain noblemen or states to the Holy Land. And so while the kingdom and its army remains small, there's always kind of an influx, a trickle in of new blood. In 1115, Baldwin, the king of Jerusalem, moves across the River Jordan, and he captures land that had been vacated by the Egyptian Fatimids. And this land is called the Outre Jordan, or beyond the Jordan. And it's here that Baldwin builds a series of very strong, very powerful castles. And these are kind of the state-of-the-art castles of the medieval era. These are the big ones. These are the mighty fortresses that even today they look quite imposing. And among them are, of course, Montreal and Carac. So if you wonder what Quebec and Israel have in common, it's Montreal. The area provides lots of revenue for the kingdom. It's a good move to take this land. It's a heavily trafficked trade route. There's lots of caravans that are going up and down this road. And if you noticed how the fortresses are placed in this map, they're in a line. It's along the caravan route because they're being protected, but in return for being protected from marauders and bandits, they're also paying taxes and revenue on the stuff that they're shipping through. And so this brings a lot of revenue into the kingdom. And also it's a very fertile agricultural area at this time, so that helps as well. This is a Carac, by the way. I want to give you an idea of what Carac looked like, or one of these Crusaders castles. It's quite big. And it's built, and this is an interesting thing with Crusader architecture. These castles are built directly into the bedrock, whereas if you look at European castles kind of the Norman era, which were being built around this time, like the Tower of London, for example, they're generally, you have one big tower in the middle, then you have a wall around it, and you might have another wall around that. That's called a concentric castle. But they're not really built into anything. They're built on top of the land. But if you see here, the walls are sloped, and if you were to go up to these stones where the angle is, they're actually carved and joined right into the bedrock. These are very, very strong castles, and they are the height, or they are the state of the art for European castle building. So now we're kind of in an intermission. So Baldwin is succeeded by his cousin, also called Baldwin, and he's a pretty good ruler, and he successfully defends the kingdom against several invasions by Egypt and by the Turks. And then it's also during Baldwin's reign that the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers are founded. And the kingdom also wrote its first book of codified laws during this time. They're signing commercial treaties with Venice. Venice is a powerful commercial republic at this time, and so Jerusalem is getting in on that. Baldwin is succeeded by his daughter Melisande and her husband, who became King Fulk V. And they had a son named Baldwin III. Some very clever names going here. Fulk V was very unpopular because he favored his own retainers, who were from France, from the area of Anjou, and he did not favor the local Crusader nobility, and so things started to get a little bit unstable in the Jerusalem government. And it's this instability in Jerusalem's leadership, this infighting, that leads to the fall of Edessa, which causes the Second Crusade. So while the leadership of Jerusalem is strong, remember they're pretty militarily, they're kind of weak. If there's a concerted effort, if all the Muslims around them had a concerted effort to push them out, they could have done it. But it's always divided, and so the king can always rush an army wherever he needs to, a full army against them. And so, but because there's all this infighting now under Fulk V, we have an issue where they're not paying attention to Edessa at the time that Edessa needs help. And so that becomes a problem for the Second Crusade. Any questions about the First Crusade or what we've discussed today so far? Okay. So we'll move on to start the Second Crusade. This one will be slightly different. So basically, as I was saying, the genesis of all this is the fall of Edessa in 1144. Edessa is the most remote Crusader state. It's the furthest out there. It's the furthest away from help. It is objectively the weakest state because of that. Because if you're not close to your friends for help in this period, you're not going to do very well. And it was very vulnerable to incursions from outside Muslim rulers. And the other problem that Edessa had was that it was constantly fighting with the Prince of Antioch and the County of Tripoli. These rulers didn't like each other. They hated each other. And so they were constantly at odds with each other. And so naturally, Edessa, being the one furthest out into Muslim territory, is at the most risk. Edessa often found itself forced into alliances with the Byzantines or with other Islamic princes. So it couldn't rely on the Christian principalities because it had basically burned those bridges. So the Count of Edessa has to rely on these other alliances, which are a little bit less reliable, I think, than an alliance with the other Christian states. So in 1144, the Count, whose name is Jocelyn II, he marches his army to aid his allies, his Muslim allies, who are called the Ortokids, in their attack on Aleppo, which is a major city in the area. And the ruler of Mosul, a guy named Zangi, saw an opportunity to capture Edessa while the Count was gone and eliminate this enemy or this ally of his enemies and this threat to his own power. And so Zangi goes to Edessa and he captures it relatively easily on Christmas Eve, 1144. And so the county of Edessa still exists, but it's really, really small. It's reduced to the area that's bordering the Principality of Antioch, essentially. Very, very small kingdom. It's basically useless at this point. But the reaction in Europe to this is catastrophic. The news of Edessa's fall is brought to Europe by pilgrims and also by ambassadors sent from the various princes of the Holy Land. And the Pope, Eugene III, says, we need to have a new crusade to take the pressure off of the other Crusader states, because Edessa is gone. We must recapture it. That's our goal of this crusade, is to reestablish that state. Interestingly, at this time, there's a rumor that a great king in the East, who would be a Christian king, a guy named Prester John, is going to come and help save the Crusader states. This is a massive myth. It doesn't exist. There is no Prester John, but he is rumored to be sort of like the John D. Rockefeller and Bill Gates of the world, and he's out beyond Iraq somewhere, and he's coming in. He's going to help save the kingdoms. But that's another one of these interesting rumors that gets started in the Middle Ages that makes its way around Europe, that kind of gains mythic status, but is absolute hokum. So the papal bull is largely ignored at first. The Pope wanted A-list type people to be on this crusade. He was aware of the weaknesses of the People's Crusade. He was aware of the damage that the People's Crusade had caused in its relationship with the Byzantines, who are still important power on the way to the Holy Land at this point. And it's not until Louis VII of France announces his intention to launch his own independent crusade that the Pope says, so I launched a crusade as the Pope. Nobody responds. But I hear that the King of France is going to launch his own crusade under his own banner. And so I say, I'm going to just attach my crusade to his crusade. And so he reissues his bull, and he basically rebrands Louis's crusade as the Pope's crusade. So this is very, very smart. The king is not terribly happy about this, but he's a very pious man, so he's just kind of going to go along with it. There are many in the French nobility who are opposed to this, and the very influential abbot of the Abbey of Saint-Denis, a guy named Suger, was opposed to this as well. He is a very important preacher in the Middle Ages in France, and he's a very important thinker, and so his opposition to this was a major obstacle. They basically didn't want the kingdom destabilized by the absence of the king. France is a different kingdom than England. When we think about medieval monarchy, when you think about England, we generally think of a unitary state, a king at the top with a bureaucracy under him, and there's a parliament, a proto-parliament, or kind of like a baby parliament at this time, and then there's the nobles, and then there's the people. But England is typically a unitary state. There's not a ton of fractiousness. There are great nobles who do fight with each other, but in terms of a unified state, a unified national identity, England has that in place at this time. It's a very united state. So if the King of England decides that he's going to take the cross and go on crusade, and he appoints a regent in his place, the kingdom's probably going to be there when he comes back. It's probably not going to be a whole lot of problem with that. But if the King of France does this, it's a completely different matter, because the King of France rules France through feudalism and through fealty almost 100%. So the King of France has the portions of modern France where Paris is, the region around Paris, the 20 square miles around Paris, is called the Ile-de-France region. This is the area that is known as the royal domain, and this is the area that the King of France controls himself. This is his personal territory. All the other territory in France is controlled by the great nobles of France, and they're only kept in line by the authority of the king in terms of his wealth and his military might, but they will often withdraw or withhold support from the king militarily, or they'll withhold taxes from him or money that he's requested from him to kind of get him to do what they want. The King of France is it can either be very, very strong or very, very weak. It depends on his wealth, his personality, his military might that he can raise from his own lands. And so at this point, if the King of France leaves France, there's a really good chance that the whole thing is going to fall apart, because the only keystone holding the arch of the French nobles together is the king. It's a lot different than the English than in England. So the Pope decides he's going to essentially launch his nuclear weapon against this sort of opposition, and he sends Bernard of Clairvaux, who is the abbot of Clairvaux, to preach in France and in Germany the Crusade. And Bernard is excellent at this. He is very effective in fanning the flames of zeal around Europe. And Louis and his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine, who we've talked about earlier in this class, they take the cross at the feet of Bernard. So at the feet of Bernard, they pledge they will go on crusade. They're there, and everybody sees this. And so they see. So when the Lords see the king taking this action in public, they also agree. Okay, fine, we'll get on board ourselves. And so Eugene, he says, I'm going to help with this a little bit more. So he authorizes indulgences, and he offers protections to people who go on crusade, which includes the remission of all time in purgatory, the protection of the church, and the protection of the church of Crusader property. So nobody could seize your property. The church was going to protect it. Protection of Crusader families. The church was going to act like their guardian. And a ban on the collection of debt and the outright forgiveness of debts. So the church was also offering that. So if you're heavily in debt and your lands are heavily mortgaged, go on crusade. You'll be forgiven. So the zeal that Bernard inspires does the same sort of thing that the zeal of the First Crusade does, and that it causes a lot of anti-Jewish riots to break out in Europe, because these are, of course, the other. These are Easterners. They're not of us, and so naturally, if you are an inspired zealot and you haven't made it to the Holy Land yet, you need to find someone else to maim or kill, and that would be the Jews, because they are not Europeans. They are not like us at all. And Bernard realized that this was a problem, and he works at trying to tamp down the zeal that he inspires, but it was kind of iffy. He was successful in some cases, but in other cases he was not. He was very good at suppressing preachers who were riding on his coattails, but in terms of suppressing actual zealotry among the people, it was a little bit more iffy. The issue also with the Second Crusade is that it's so successful, it results in several other crusades being launched at the same time. So Bernard's efforts in France and southern Germany are very successful, but in northern Germany and in Saxony, they said, look, we get it, you want to go on crusade, but we would rather crusade against the pagan Slavic peoples in the northeast. This is the Baltic Sea region in Prussia and in what is now Russia. And the Pope said, oh, okay, fine, you can go on crusade in this Baltic area. And these guys really played no part in the Second Crusade in the Middle East. And in Spain and in Portugal, the Reconquista is going on. So this is where the Christian kingdoms of Spain and Portugal are attempting to reconquer the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslims. And so they say, well, we're going to call this a crusade too. And so they have their crusade down there, and the Pope authorizes that. He expands the crusading bull and says any crusades in aid of the Reconquista, they get all the benefits as well. And so you have a group of crusaders from England and Flanders and Holland and in Scotland, and they go to Spain. They're going to help liberate Lisbon from the Muslims. And so you only really are stuck with the French and southern German knights and kings going to the Holy Land. And so this is made up of Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany. Now, as we all know, in European history, the French and Germans get along very, very well, which is not the case at all. And that has long roots, and it is eminently demonstrated here. So the forces of the Muslim rulers in the Middle East is a little bit different than in the First Crusade. Zengi, who we talked about when he conquered Edessa, was succeeded by a guy named Nur ad-Din, and Nur ad-Din had formed a united empire surrounding the Crusader state. So things are starting to coalesce in the Islamic world at this time. The German Crusader army consists of about 20,000 knights. The French had about 700 knights. So the German contingent is larger than the French. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had about 1,000 knights and 6,000 infantry, so they had an army of around 7,000 men available to them at this point. And Conrad III is largely thought of as a very brave knight in Europe, while Louis is constantly berated as being very poor at war and far more interested in his wife than actually fighting. Which makes sense because Eleanor is a noted beauty and she comes with a ton of land and riches. And so why wouldn't you be more interested in your wife than in fighting? So what you see there is the route that they took into the Holy Land. There's essentially two routes. There's an overland route and a sea route, and this kind of gives you a more fulsome idea of what they did. So you see the French and the Germans. They're the yellow and the blue arrows. They go from Europe. They march down through Constantinople. Several contingents will go to the Holy Land by sea. Others will go by land. They'll break up and reform several times before they get to the Holy Land. And on the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see a red arrow that shows the English and the North European contingent going to attack Lisbon. So that's kind of the route that they took. So the Crusaders march as two contingents, French and German, and they pass through Eastern Europe relatively unscathed, but when they get to the Byzantine Empire, things go wrong, as they typically do when you get to the Byzantine border. The emperor is very concerned about the movement of Crusaders through his territory, as his predecessor was in the First Crusade. The Byzantines have not forgotten what the Crusaders did in the First Crusade, and so they are escorted through Byzantine territory by Byzantine army units. But nonetheless, they still managed to find a way to pillage the land and to fight with the Byzantine army units on the way. So it's not a really great relationship to start off with. They also ignored the emperor's decree that they have to pay for all the food that they take. So they're essentially looting food from Byzantine civilians. It's very lucky that the emperor didn't just cut them off when they started this whole thing. The Crusaders were also kind of suspicious of Manuel because Manuel had concluded a peace treaty with the Turks just before the Crusaders arrived in Constantinople. So they thought, this guy's not really on our side. If he had been, he would have kept the war against the Turks going, and he could be relied on as an ally kind of against the Turks, right? Because they're going to cross into Turkish territory eventually. But Manuel evidently thought that the Crusader army was far more dangerous than the Turkish army. So there were rumors at this time among the Germans that there was a large army massing in Anatolia, a large Muslim army, and so the Germans pick up and they leave Constantinople relatively quickly. And the emperor advises the Crusaders, as Alexius had in the First Crusade, to stay along the coast, don't venture inland. But the Germans ignored this. Conrad was not ready for the dry conditions he faced. The Europeans have no experience in desert warfare because Europe doesn't really have any deserts. And he didn't have enough access to water. He didn't have enough food. He had a very poor understanding of the geography that he was going through. And he had a very poor understanding of just, time in general. And so he way underestimated the amount of time it would take for him to get to Iconium, which was his target. He took the best of the German knights and troops with him, and then he sent the rest of the army to go with his brother Otto by the coastal road. So he doesn't take the whole army inland with him, just the best of it. And at Dorylaeum, if you remember Dorylaeum, which is where the First Crusade suffered, I believe, a major defeat. Or no, the Seljuk Turks suffered a major defeat. A group of Seljuk archers attacked the German contingent, and the Germans retreated to Nicaea. And Conrad, who was wounded in this, went to Constantinople. His brother Otto would be defeated at Laodicea, and most of his army would be destroyed or sold into slavery by the Turks at that time. So things are not going well for the Germans in their first foray into Asia Minor. The French is a little bit different. Louis VII and Manuel have a bit of a better relationship than the Germans did with the Byzantines, and the Germans leave Constantinople earlier than the French do. And the French move along a coastal road. They take the advice of the emperor, and they move inland instead of moving inland. And as they are marching along the coast, they meet the remnants of Conrad's army, the survivors coming back from the inland to join the French on their march to the Holy Land. So the emperor kind of plays into Crusader fears about him in that he refuses to aid them at this time because they had plundered and pillaged Byzantine territory as they went along. And so he decides to punish them in that way. And so the Turks, they have moved an army to Ephesus at this time to attack the French, but the French actually beat them back. And when they reach, and the French reach Laodicea just after Otto's defeat, the king's brother, the German king's brother. And the army then becomes separated, and the Turks inflict a lot of losses on them in battle on the 6th of January. And as this kind of goes on, the Turks would constantly harass the French and German armies and destroy supplies and burn fields around them, partially to destroy supplies. But if you burn fields around an army, it's also going to dry out their throats, and it's going to make marching a lot more difficult. So it's really a psychological thing as well as a strategic thing. And when they get to Adalia, which is a port on the southern end of Anatolia, Louis VII decides he's had enough and he wants to continue by sea. So Louis assembles a fleet at Adalia, but there's a bunch of storms going on in the Mediterranean, and his ships aren't arriving in time. And so he finally decides after a month that he's just going to pick up and go with the ships that he has. So he takes a portion of the army, he puts them on ships, and the rest have to march by land. The Turks again harass the army going by land, and there's lots of deprivations and all that kind of thing going on. But Louis reaches Antioch by ship in 1148, and he's welcomed by his wife's uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, who had become Prince of Antioch in the time during this time. So Raymond wants his help. He wants Louis's help to attack Aleppo, which is a major Muslim city. And it's a city that is the main access point for Edessa. If the Crusaders are going to help retake Edessa, they need to take Aleppo. Louis refuses. He's not interested. At this point, he has decided that the spiritual side of his crusade is more important than the military objective. In short, he thinks himself more as a pilgrim than as a military leader at this point. And things are complicated by a rumor that has started that Eleanor and her uncle have started to have an affair during this time. And it's at this time that Louis and Eleanor's marriage really starts to fall apart. If this were just a rumor, it would probably have been laughed off, but it doesn't seem to have been just a rumor. There seems to have been actually something going on there. But so in any case, this kind of destroys Louis, who had really loved Eleanor. That love kind of just falls apart as infidelity does in marriages, and it kind of weakens Louis's resolve, and so he's not really into the fighting part of it anymore. Remember, he wasn't into the fighting to begin with. He's criticized as being a non-martial king, and so this just kind of breaks him a little bit more. So the German army, including Conrad and Otto, have arrived in Jerusalem at this time, what's left of it, and so the French are in Antioch, the Germans are in Jerusalem, and now it's time to gather the clans together and decide what we're going to do. There's also the Crusaders from England and Holland who had stopped in Lisbon to help, or had stopped in Iberia to help capture Lisbon. They're arriving now too. They've managed to successfully capture Lisbon, and so they're coming now to reinforce their crusade. So Baldwin III of Jerusalem, he sends the Patriarch of Jerusalem to invite the French to join him in Jerusalem and to reunite the Crusader forces. And now the Islamic rulers of the surrounding Zangid Sultanate, they're all very well aware of the increased presence of Crusaders in Jerusalem, and they begin to prepare to deal with any attacks. Now, there are internal rivalries that are happening. So what's happening is the Zangid Sultanate, the Sultan Zangi, and his successor Nur ad-Din, is trying to form an army to meet the Christian rulers head on. But the internal rivalries among the local Muslim lords mean that troops that were meant to help defend Damascus and Aleppo never really arrived. So there's still, despite the fact that Zangi and Nur ad-Din have managed to consolidate Islamic power in the region surrounding the Crusader states, there are nonetheless internal rivalries which are weakening the resolve which could have been there to begin with. So the Crusaders hold a council at Acre in June of 1148, and they have been encouraged by the arrival of extra forces from Europe. So the original target of the Second Crusade is Edessa, but it had become very clear that that city was very firmly in the hands of the Muslims, and it was not feasible to rescue Edessa's count, Jocelyn II. He had been captured by the Muslims, and he was in jail. So the council discusses whether they should attack Aleppo or Damascus, both major Muslim centers. Aleppo is a major threat to Antioch and Tripoli, and it's the capital of the Sultan Nur ad-Din. But Louis was not in favor of Aleppo. He did not really care about northern Syria, and the rumors of an incestuous relationship between his wife and his uncle had caused him to have very little concern for Antioch. Remember, Raymond is the Prince of Antioch, and he's cheating with Louis's wife, so Louis is not really all that interested in saving Antioch. The Count of Tripoli had been on his way to the council, but he had been poisoned on the way, and so he, of course, was not there to argue for Aleppo either, even though that would have been his preferred thing. Conrad, also not in favor of attacking Aleppo, and the reason is because of their crusading vows. So the crusading vow is to defend Jerusalem. Aleppo is in the north. It's beside the Blue Principality of Antioch there. The bigger threat, they feel, to Jerusalem is Damascus. Damascus is that dot kind of in the green just to the northeast of Acre. And so they decide that it's best to attack Jerusalem or Ascalon. So Ascalon was another option. Ascalon was not chosen because if it had been captured, and this is where politics comes in, if Ascalon had been captured, it would have been added to the territory of the Count of Jaffa, who was the brother of the king, and the king's mother, Melisande, favored the Count of Jaffa over the king, Baldwin. So their personal family rivalries play in here. And also, Ascalon had been surrounded by castles during Baldwin's father's reign, and so they felt that it wasn't as big a threat as it actually was. So the council decides to attack Damascus, and it also has, Damascus has an important role in Christian history, of course, because Paul is converted on the road to Damascus, so it has Christian symbolism attached to it. And so for Louis and Conrad, who have taken the crusading vow and who are feeling very pious, this is a very good option as opposed to Aleppo or Ascalon. So what they're also trying to do here by capturing Damascus would be to limit Nur ad-Din's power. Nur ad-Din wants Damascus for himself, and so there's kind of a battle between the Crusaders and the Muslims as to who is going to get Damascus. Damascus had also been an objective of the First Crusade, but it had never been fulfilled, and Jerusalem had attempted to conquer it several times, but had always failed. And the rulers of Damascus, seeing the issue here, began to realign their foreign policy. So before this, they were kind of aligned with Egypt and or Jerusalem as things were at the time, but now they started to align themselves with Nur ad-Din in Aleppo. And so, because they know that the Crusaders have made them a target. So the siege of Damascus begins in July of 1148. It's a huge disaster. The Crusaders attack through the fertile area of orchards, which is to the west of the city. But the orchards, being orchards, are very well fortified, and it's difficult for horses to move in orchards because of the trees and whatnot. And it's easy to hide people in the trees, so they can attack guerrilla style. The hit-and-run tactics really do confuse the Europeans, who are more used to fighting on a large field of battle. And the Damascene defenders, they call for help from Nur ad-Din and Aleppo. And so the Crusaders, on July 27th, a few days after they start the siege, they decide that they're going to attack now from the east, because this is less well defended. But it was also an area that was very poor in resources. So they take the risk that they can attack this weaker area of the city and do so in enough time that their resources won't run out. So there were rumors that the rulers of Damascus, a guy named Unar, had bribed some leaders to move to a less advantageous position. So this is a rumor that's going around in the Crusader camp. The Crusader camp, the rumor is that the leader of Damascus has bribed the leaders of the Crusade to move to this position, and so there a lot of mistrust now begins to grow in Crusader ranks. And the arrival of reinforcements from Aleppo makes the situation very untenuous, and the Crusaders retreat to Jerusalem, and they're under fire the entire way. And thus, the Second Crusade. This destroys the Second Crusade. So Conrad III then decides, well, he's going to attempt to capture Ascalon, but nobody joined him because, again, feelings of betrayal. And so Conrad picks up and he goes back to Constantinople to cement ties with Manuel and to return to Germany. Louis VII and Eleanor, they stay in the Holy Land until 1149, but their marriage has been irreparably damaged, and they board separate ships to go back to France. And Bernard of Clairvaux, the great promoter of the Crusade, was so horrified by its failure that he personally apologized to the Pope. And he blamed the failure, naturally, on Crusader sinfulness. It was the sinfulness of these Crusaders that caused this thing to fail, and I am very sorry about that. Franco-Byzantine relations were shattered as the French considered that Manuel had betrayed them by making peace with the Turks. And Jerusalem, while it would later capture Ascalon and even get to Cairo in the 1160s, it basically set the scene for Jerusalem's fall later on, because it just weakened it to a point where it just couldn't recover from. So the successor of Nur ad-Din is a guy named Saladin, who you've probably heard of. He becomes Sultan of Egypt, and he's the guy who really unites all the Muslim kingdoms surrounding the Crusader states into one united force. And he would capture Jerusalem in 1187, which would initiate the Third Crusade. So just a little bit on Saladin. I just want to get through this. We'll try and go as quickly as I can. Saladin had become the Sultan of Egypt and Syria in 1174, and he began to consolidate power in the Middle East. And he was constantly kind of stymied by the Zangid Sultan of Mosul, but that's not going to be important for our purposes. He abolishes the Fatimid Caliphate. So you remember the two caliphates I was talking about. He abolishes them, and he reorients foreign policy towards allegiance to the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. And he's a pretty good political leader. He uses Sunni Islam as a rallying point for his people, and he promises a holy war to rid the Middle East of the Franks. So this is really about uniting the Muslim people to accomplish this single goal. Now, the Crusader noblemen, while Saladin does this, he also will conclude limited peaces with Jerusalem throughout time to kind of, give yourself a break from war. But there is a Crusader nobleman named Reynald of Chatillon who makes a nuisance of himself by raiding Muslim caravans. If you've ever seen the movie Kingdom of Heaven, this is a major plot point in it. And he would raid caravans when the kingdom was under peace or at peace with Saladin. And Saladin was incensed at this, and he swore revenge. So the king of Jerusalem at this time is a guy named Guy of Lusignan, who had succeeded his brother-in-law, Baldwin V, who was a leper, and he died relatively young. Saladin essentially lures Guy to come and attack him out in the desert, and the army of Jerusalem was, it should say, destroyed there, but it doesn't. So Saladin once he destroys the Crusader army, or the Jerusalem army, he then lays siege to Jerusalem in 1187. So the battle that destroys the Jerusalem army is called the Battle of Hattin. You can see it located there. It's on the Golan Heights. I believe that would be the Golan Heights now. And he assembles an army of about 40,000, and he puts the city of Tiberias under siege. And that draws Guy of Lusignan to take the army of Jerusalem to stop him, to relieve the siege. And Guy's army numbers about 20,000 men. This is the bulk of Jerusalem's army. He only leaves a few knights in the city to protect it. And Saladin lures Guy out into an area beyond Tiberias where there's very, very little water. And Guy, being so arrogant in his manner, goes out there and thinks he's going to take on Saladin. So he moves his army into this area where they have no water and very few, if any, supplies. The battle is a huge disaster for Guy. The Saladin's army used the old tactic of starting fires around Guy's army to use smoke to parch them and to demoralize them, and the Jerusalem army is very quickly routed and is very resoundingly defeated. And the king was captured, Guy of Lusignan was captured, as were many high-ranking Jerusalem nobles, and the Sultan executes Reynald of Chantillon because he had sworn to. He was going to get revenge, and he imprisons Guy and the other ransomed, and he ransoms the other nobles, so the nobles could pay their way out of captivity if they wanted to. So Saladin executes all the Templars and all the Hospitallers he finds because they are the most dangerous of the Jerusalem forces, and they are the most fervent. In the siege of Jerusalem, he manages to, or rather, everybody who remains in Jerusalem is either ransomed or sold for slavery. So the siege of Jerusalem is not really a thing. It's not really a siege. His army pulls up. There's nobody left in the city. The leaders of Jerusalem quickly realize this, and then they go and they try and make peace. That's the siege of Jerusalem in a nutshell. And it's markedly different than the siege that the Crusaders launched in 1099. Whereas in 1099, the Crusaders massacred everybody. Saladin is very keen to avoid as much bloodshed as possible. He doesn't want to be equated with the Franks of 1099. He is conscious of PR. Public relations is very important to him. And so he wants to be seen as a strong ruler, but a merciful ruler as well. And so he negotiates this surrender. And he says, okay, so he agrees with the city leaders that if the Crusaders surrendered the city, they could leave the city by paying a ransom of 10 dinars for a man, 5 dinars for a woman, and 2 dinars for each child. So you could pay your way out of the city. Now, there's a lot of poor people in Jerusalem. Not everybody can do this. And so the Jerusalem leaders negotiate with Saladin. And they eventually agree to free 100,000, or agreed on 100,000 dinars to free everyone who could not pay their own ransom. So if you couldn't pay your own ransom, you might be considered under this alternate plan. But the defenders of Jerusalem could only raise 30,000 dinars. And so the Sultan decides, well, okay, for this I will allow 7,000 who cannot pay their own ransoms to leave. He restores the Muslim holy sites. Muslim prisoners are freed. Saladin even allows several thousand noblewomen to leave the city without even paying. He's very merciful to them. He also frees freely aged and infirm residents. And in the end, about 15,000 people who could not pay were sold into slavery. So there's still a significant number of people who are sold into slavery, but they're not massacred, which is completely different. Native Christians, so Christians who were born and bred in Jerusalem, we're talking basically of Orthodox Christians, Christians who had a family lineage there, were allowed to remain in the city, and he protected Christian holy sites and Christian places of pilgrimage, which is like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, for example, was protected by Saladin as a place of pilgrimage. Remember, pilgrimage is a big revenue source, so they want to keep this thing going. And news of the fall of Jerusalem will spur the states or the kings of Europe to launch the Third Crusade to liberate Jerusalem and to restore the Christian states. And at the end of Saladin's conquest of the Crusader states, this is what remains of them. So remember that first map where you have the county of Edessa in the north, and then you have the Principality of Antioch, and then you have the county of Tripoli, and then you have the kingdom of Jerusalem. This is what's left when Saladin is done with them. The kingdom of Jerusalem is basically gone. The county of Tripoli remains. The Principality of Antioch remains. And this will be the situation that brings the Third Crusade, which includes the great English hero Richard the Lionheart, into the Holy Land. And after this time, the Christians will never again possess Jerusalem, except, I believe, under when Frederick, the Emperor of Germany, buys it in the Fifth Crusade. He actually buys it back for a while. But in any case, this is what it looks like. So it's a pretty good end run. So anyway, that takes us through the Second Crusade. It's a lot different than the First Crusade. The Kingdom of Jerusalem lasted, roughly 150-ish years. Didn't last very long, but the romance of it, the aura of it remained for much, much longer. In fact, numerous kings of Europe, including, I believe, the King of France and the Emperor of Austria, claimed the title of King of Jerusalem up until their monarchies fell. So that notion of King of Jerusalem very much survives. So anyway, that's the Second Crusade. Any questions on that? Second Crusade, First Crusade? No? Perfect. Great. So we will resume next class. We'll talk about the Third Crusade, and then assuming that we get through that, we will move on to the final crusade, which will be the Fifth and the Sixth Crusade. There won't be a ton to talk about there because they're basically non-entities. And then we will have moved beyond the main crusading period. Although crusades will be launched at numerous times by numerous kings throughout the Middle Ages, there are 6 main ones that we consider. And then after that, we'll hopefully get into talking about the Inquisition, and we'll get to talking a little bit about theology in the Middle Ages because we have not covered that, and that's important to set us up for the Reformation. So we'll just end it there, and we'll hopefully see you next week.